Everyone, it's Emily Fox. Today's video is going to be a throwback kind of video. You might have seen the title, the thumbnail, and be wondering, Emily, 2016, what are you talking about? It's not a mistake. It's not a mistake. In the last couple of years, I finally started doing some of my all-time favorite videos, 2 of them specifically every year that I never got a chance to do for the past couple of years because I started doing Booktube 8 years ago. So I didn't have these videos and I think it's sad. I want to fix that for the first couple of years I was on here. So we're going to do that. It's going to be an ongoing series for the next month and a half. About once a week, I will be posting one, and we're starting with 2016. So the 2 videos that I really love doing are, first off, my #1 best book of each year. I've only done 2 so far for 2022, 2023, and I think it's a really fun way to look back at the best book that I had read that year, and I can spend the whole next year raving about it until every single one of you has read it, hopefully. But also, more recently, I started doing my monthly favorite for each month, the first couple of months of the year. I just posted one for 2024 if you haven't seen it. And it's a fun way to give you a preview of what's going to happen for my best book of the year, but also some months I haven't had any favorites, so I have to choose a book to give a shout out to. So it's basically going to give me a chance to show you all the books that I read each month during that year, choose one, and then we're going to end up with my #1 best book of each year for 2016 to 2021. So we have 6 years to go through, 6 videos. This is the first one, so we're going back to 2016. So in 2016, I started posting videos on Booktube at the end of July, so I officially started reading in August, so I only read for 5 months. According to Goodreads, I finished 55 books. I think there might be 1 or 2 that I DNF'd, but just over 50 books, which is kind of crazy. I was a reading machine. Although looking back, I looked quickly, and there were a lot more YA books than I read nowadays. I do feel like eventually you find out what really works for you. At first, you're just reading what's popular on Booktube, and I went through that same phase. But I still found quite a bit of favorites, even though when you start, you don't necessarily know what constitutes 5 stars. So I'm aware that my personal taste has changed, and also by choosing favorites, it's going to be from a 2024 lens. I'm going to try to take into consideration what I would have liked at the time, but I don't know if my #1 is going to be what I would have chosen at the time, but at the same time, it's going to be a pro that you will see which books actually stood the test of time, and I still think about 6 years later. So in August of 2016, I finished 12 books. I'm going to include a quick review of all of them since some of these I haven't talked about in like 8 years, so might as well. The first book on my list is Everything, this is a good example when I say that my taste has changed. I figured out what worked for me. I used to see a lot of YA contemporary, and I've since realized they're not for me, especially the romancy one. And this one, it starts fine, but it ended up pissing me off, even at the time, which again, I've become a lot more comfortable saying that I don't like a book, even though it's popular. And this one I didn't really care for even at the time, so that was a flop for me. The Remedy I liked at the time. It's like a dystopian. People end up playing the roles of like dead people for the family to grieve. I don't think this was the first book in the series. I think it was part of like a companion series, but at the time I enjoyed it. Also, why? Wonder made me feel like a monster because it is middle grade, and I've since realized it doesn't really work for me, but the child, it became a movie, right? The child has a facial deformity, and children end up being really nice to him by the end, which felt a little unrealistic to me, but who knows? I don't work with children. Cinder was another, why is it fantasy, sci-fi? It's a retelling of Cinderella, and I didn't really care that much for it. I tried to continue this series and I couldn't. I ended up getting rid of all of them, but that's another one that like I was seeing really popular. It's why very readable, but was not for me. I did read The Martian. I think this is officially my first audiobook ever, but this is fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Adult sci-fi. We've probably all seen the movie. I definitely think that it's worth reading. I've since discovered that the author can only write 1 character, but it really worked for this one. I really enjoy following someone trying to survive with only like their wit in space, so this was great. City of Bones. This was another one that was really popular adult fantasy series. I hated the ending. I tried the second book. I don't know if it's that same year. We'll see. But it continues, and I still don't understand that. I feel like this is one of those series that like if you read when you're young, you are just emotionally attached to it and you're not objective. I mean, everyone's opinion is subjective, obviously, but I don't understand why it's so popular. And I'm kind of glad it's not as popular nowadays. I feel like it wasn't good. But again, I didn't grow up reading it, so there's that. The Help, at the time I did enjoy it. I have since heard some very valid I have since heard some very valid concern about it, and I feel like I would probably feel a little differently about it now. Next, we have Red Rising. I read that during my first month on BookTube. Poor me, because at the time I felt really weirdly about my review about it because I didn't feel like I was loving it as much as everyone else. And I think this is considered adult sci-fi, but at the time I felt like it was also very YA. And I found it a little underwhelming. Quite, and I feel like nowadays I feel like it was very underwhelming, but probably in popular opinion. But yeah, it was just okay. Not a favorite for sure. The Silver Witch, I'm pretty sure this is like the third book in a series. I didn't know any better. It was fine though. The Rat and the Dawn, which is also the first book in a duology YA fantasy, and this one was also super concerned about everyone because it's romance, like fantasy romance, and I don't understand why people thought it was romantic because that man is problematic. I no. Next we have I'll Give You the Sun, which was on the YA contemporary that did work for me. I did really love it. At the time I gave it 5 star. I don't know how I would feel about it in 2024. I know some people had issues with the writing style. It's very lyrical, but I really enjoyed it at the time. You're following these twins. There are 2 timelines, like 3 years in between. In the past, they're friends. In the future, they're not. Something has happened between them. You're not fully sure what happened, and you're following them. And I really, really loved it at the time. And then the last book I finished that month was A Darker Shade of Magic, which V.E. Schwab, which first book in a adult fantasy series. I love the world building. I like the characters in the first book. And I think at the time I also gave it 5 stars. So a solid read for sure still in 2024. So if I had to choose a #1 favorite, again, modern lens, but one that I still think is amazing. I think if you've heard my reviews now, it's pretty obvious, but The Martian. It's really solid. Like I said, it's a great audiobook. It's a great movie. I don't even like Matt Damon, and I love the movie. And it's just a fun ride. I enjoyed it. Again, valid concerns when people say that they don't care for sense of humor. Cool. I did. I loved it. So, my best book for August of 2016. Will it be the best one of the year, though? We have to continue. Let's look at September. In September, I officially finished 14 books, which, how did I read so many books at the time? To be fair, I think I had done a challenge where I was reading like a book a day kind of thing. Crazy, but they were on the shorter side still. I did start that month reading Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, and I was so sad because I hadn't realized that it wasn't actually officially part of this world. It's basically fan fiction. I feel like nowadays everyone agrees that it was rough. I think I've heard that the actual play is better, but yeah, that was a fail for me even at the time. Witches of Lynchford. It's a short book, and it was a little underwhelming. It's like witches from our time. I think they're against like this big company. Really, it was really forgettable. So The Rest of Us Just Live Here. It's one of those books that has a really fun premise, but the execution is kind of just meh. You're following the story of these characters that are just trying to live their life in their town while some superhero fantasy world stuff is happening. So like you're kind of getting a little bit of an intro at each chapter of what's going on for that character, and then the consequences on everyone else, which sounds really cool, but again, in practice, you realize normal people are kind of boring. And like I feel like the author didn't fully stick to that script too, so it was okay. It was okay. The Lath of Heaven was a really good book, really fun premise. It made me struggle though because English is my second language. Ursula K. Le Guin's writing is a little bit difficult, but it was worth it. It is an adult sci-fi standalone. It's kind of on the shorter side. I think it's like 170 pages. And the main character realizes that their dreams seem to be affecting the world, and they go see a psychiatrist, and they realize, oh, I can actually use them to change the world. So you following that story, and I did remember enjoying it, even though I struggled a little bit. Nerve was a YA dystopian that did not really stick with me. Is it reality TV show kind of vibe? It was okay. Station 11, I think, is my first post-apocalyptic book that made me realize that I do like that genre, although this one was a little bit more too literally fiction for my personal taste. I've tried a couple of her books at this point, and she's not really for me, but in this one you're following the consequences after a pandemic killed most of the population, and you're following the story mostly of these people that are part of a Shakespeare play troupe, and they're walking around doing that. And it was okay. It was okay. Not for me, but I understand why people love it. I had to put down The Uglies, which I think was just picked up and adapted as a TV show, which I had no interest, so I put it down because I couldn't deal with it. It's also YA dystopian. Living Dead Girl, I think it's about like SA, like a girl is kidnapped. I tried to forget what it was about, to be honest. At the time, I didn't expect it, so I kind of just moved on from it. The Grown Up is my first book by Gillian Flynn, which I think this is her weakest book, but it's a really interesting one, a really weird one. So if you enjoy her books, you have to check that one out. It was very different from everything else. City of Ashes, so the second book in the Mortal Instruments series. This was frustrating for me because I was hoping that the ending of book 1 would be finally proven false in book 2 because it was such a mess. That twist was just stupid, honestly. I don't say that often, but it was straight up stupid. And book 2 doesn't explain it. So I basically kept pushing through, hoping for that reveal, and didn't happen in book 2. And I was like, okay, why is everyone liking this series? But definitely not my best book. Then I started rereading Harry Potter, so I read the first one. Then I read A Gathering of Shadow, which is the second book in the V.E. Schwab series, and I love this. I feel like it's an unpopular opinion. A lot of people didn't care for book 2, but personally, I think it was my favorite one. I enjoyed, again, that world building. I didn't explain it. You have these 4 Londons. Some people have certain powers. The magic seems to be somewhat disappearing, but only like very, very few people seem to have the power to travel between those 4 Londons, including one of the main characters. So you follow the story, and again, I really liked book 2. Then I read my first fantasy romance series that I actually liked. I don't know how I would feel about it in 2024, but at the time, the Winners series was a winner for me. I enjoyed A Winner's Crime and A Winner's Kiss in September and gave them 5-star, or at least the second one. I feel like when you have a fantasy romance series, book 2 is usually where there's a lot of like struggling, you know? The love interest was introduced in book 1, book 2 is the struggle, and then eventually the resolution in book 3, and I remember really enjoying it. Main character is the daughter, I think, of a general in that fantasy world, and they have conquered this other kingdom, and she falls in love with essentially a slave, which now that I say that out loud sounds pretty problematic, but again, at the time, I really enjoyed it. So if I have to choose a favorite for September, I will have to give it to A Gathering of Shadows, which I don't, if that would have been my answer at the time, I feel like I probably would have said Winner's Kiss, but I'm realizing at the time I used to read a ton of books just because they were popular, and it wasn't going super well for me. But again, in 2016, I would have told you I was having the best time. So it's just looking back, I don't feel like most of these really stood the test of time, but it makes sense. It's been 8 years, and I really know what works for me now. But let's move on to October of 2016. There are so many books on here that I haven't talked about in forever. So even though they were not all favorites, some of them were though, it's still really fun to give you a review because you might have not heard my thoughts on them, and you get the chance to get like 50 reviews in one video. So the first book that I finished that month was Night, which is a World War II memoir kind of story. I've mentioned how I'm a little over World War II because I feel like I've read so many, but this one is definitely worth checking out. It is a short book. I believe this is technically part of a 3-book series. I've only read the first one, but the author talks about his personal experience in the concentration camp. So of course it's going to be impactful. Of course it's going to be good, if depressing, obviously. So I did remember enjoying this one. Then I read Dark Matter, which was my first Blake Crouch book, and I have to say, extremely readable sci-fi thrillers. It has only recently been picked up and adapted as a TV show, which I did also enjoy. At the time, again, I feel like I wasn't as heavy on the critiques. I was just trying to figure out what worked for me. But I did notice that when it does read like a movie, which may or may not work for you, I personally am not someone that is too difficult with the writing. And if it's very heavy on the prose or anything, it's not a deal breaker for me. So it will keep you up at night though. You want to figure out what happens because you're following the main character who is like a 40-year-old teacher. He's married, he has a kid, and he gets kidnapped. And then when he wakes up, his wife is not his wife, his son is nowhere to be found, and he's trying to, you know, figure out what happened, go back to his life. I do have to say that the author in general is not great with his characters. They tend to be quite 2D, especially his female characters, let's just say it. But I did overall really enjoy this, and this would be part of the list of books I would categorize as a dad book recommendation. Obviously, I'm not a dad, did love it though. But if you're looking for a book for men in your life, they tend to like this book, and I tend to be kind of hit and miss in general with thrillers, but the sci-fi ones tend to work better, and this was one of those. Then we have Vicious by V.E. Schwab. I had enjoyed 2 books by her. I wanted to continue, and this was really popular. This one is more of a sci-fi, but instead of following superheroes, you follow supervillains, which tends to work better for me than the superhero books. And in this one, you follow these 2 characters. It sounds like they used to be friends, but they're kind of enemies, and you don't really know exactly what happened, and you're just following the storyline. I enjoyed book 1. Personally, I enjoyed book 2 better, which is, again, the unpopular opinion, but this was a solid one. Again, I enjoyed supervillains. Then I read Bird Box, which became a movie afterwards, which I think I liked the movie better, which another unpopular opinion, but book 1, I really enjoyed the sci-fi horror vibes. Main character that doesn't look outside. She lives with these 2 children that they're just called boy and girl, no names, and they're just trying to survive. You get some flashbacks of what happened, but I feel like you never get a proper answer in the book, and I hate those. Again, I didn't really know at the time, but it is one of my personal pet peeves, especially in horror books. I feel like it's very common. I don't care what the answer is. I don't care if it's alien, if it's ghost, if it's a disease, whatever it is in the horror setting. I just want you, as an author, to do your job and tell me. And I feel like this book started my hatred of Again, I feel like the movie is different. You get more of an answer, but I remember really being mad, really, at the ending. The author has since come out with a second book, which answers things, but I thought the book was kind of bad. But yeah, I needed to mention it because I remember this being the first book that really annoyed me about the ending. So, Bird Box. I did continue my reread of Harry Potter and read the second one, so Harry Potter and Chambers of Secret. Then I read You, another book that got adapted since. A lot of them have been picked up, and I haven't really watched a TV show, but I think the TV show might be better than the book. I do think that it had some weaknesses, but it was the first time I read a book that was written at the second person, so like you, which made it super creepy. You're following the story through the eyes of the stalker, and you're trying not to really empathize with him, but again, you're in his head, so it's kind of complex. And I had overall enjoyed it. It had, again, some weaknesses, but it was very different for me. I did not end up continuing the series, but again, it became a TV show, which I think is better and more popular, but damn, it's been 8 years. Crazy. Okay. Then I read The Girl on the Train, which I feel like a lot of people hate nowadays, but I feel like that's what happens with a lot of books. They become really popular, so people pick it up hoping that it's going to be great because it has gotten so much hype, but it's too hyped, so people end up being disappointed. I personally read it when it was not as popular. My expectations were not super high, so I enjoyed it for what it was. It was the first book that I read that is like a mystery thriller where the main female character is an alcoholic, which I have since started hating because it was overdone. And I feel like it seems almost like a cheap way to make the narration unreliable, but at the time I did not have that issue and I did enjoy it, so it was fun for me at the time. Then I read More Than This, which started my love of stories where the main character dies in the beginning. I feel like I want to read more books. I've only read a couple like that, and I've enjoyed all of them. It is dystopian sci-fi, and it was a 5-star at the time, I'm pretty sure. You're following, like I said, the main character dies and they wake up and they're trying to figure out what happened, and you don't want to know anything else. It was good. I do recommend it still. Then I tried to read some Neil Gaiman. I did finish it. I read The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and I didn't understand the hype about him. I read another one by him, and since I've given up, I've gotten rid of everything. He has since been called problematic, which I know a lot of people were disappointed, but again, I had already given up on him years ago. But yeah, this one was just okay for me. I feel like I've realized again with this book that sometimes magic systems, when they're too vague and like almost magical realism, like they just don't work for me. So that wasn't for me. A Monster Calls was one of the first book that made me cry, or like cry, but misty eyes a little bit. You follow the main character who is struggling, has received some sad notes. It is a YA fantasy. It feels almost like a fairy tale-esque at times, and if you get the chance, I would recommend getting the physical books because of the pictures. I really like it. I still have it somewhere on my shelf, so that one was definitely worth checking out. I did enjoy it. Inhalation is the first book in a sci-fi series. It was the only book I read in that series because I didn't end up loving it. It's also one of those that it's like too vague for me to actually end up enjoying, but the characters don't even have, a name. It seems to be like alien related, but you don't really know what's going on. I did feel like some scenes were really creepy in a good way, like you're really uncomfortable, like when she's going down this tower. That was good. I've since watched a movie, and I don't think it makes things that much more clear. But It's a trilogy. You probably have to push through to get the answers, but I didn't. Then I read 13 Reasons Why, which that it's been so long. Again, has been adapted since. At the time, I did really enjoy it. Nowadays, I probably would have a lot more concerns, but I liked it for what it was at the time. And then the last one I finished for that month was Dark Places, another book by Gillian Flynn, and I did overall enjoy it. I think she writes really interesting, morally gray female characters, so that was good. So, looking back, if I had to choose my best book for October, I think I would give it to Dark Matter. Again, it's not a perfect book, but it was extremely readable, and I feel like I haven't found as many books as I was hoping for that will keep me up reading until 2 in the mornings, and this one is definitely one of those. November of 2016, I finished 10 books, and I feel like I was starting to figure out what works for me a little bit more, and I found a lot of favorites, finally. So the first book that I finished was End of Watch by Stephen King, which I've recently talked about it because I was talking about his top 10 most popular books, then I ended up talking about my personal favorites, and I love this one. Unfortunately for me, this is the last book in a trilogy. It's one of the first audiobook I had ever listened to. I didn't know any better. I used my library for it and didn't realize it was the last book in a series. And to be honest, it actually stands on its own pretty well. There were only a few moments I was like, I feel like we don't know much about this one character. And I thought maybe it's because I'm not used to listening to audiobooks, but no, it's because it's the third book. But it was really good. I did watch the first season of Mr. Mercedes, which is the first book of the series. And I do think the series in general is worth it. I'm not going to go back because, again, I have read the last one, but this was a solid read, even though it was only the third book. Then I read The Kind Worth Killing, which is also a mystery thriller. At the time, I loved it. A lot of twists and turns. The premise is intriguing. You have these two characters that meet for the first time at a bar at the airport, and this man starts talking about his wife, and then they kind of plan a way to murder her, and you're just following the story. I don't remember much because it's been 8 years, but I remember really loving it, and I recommended it a ton, and I know a lot of you read this and loved it, so. But I've forgotten a lot, which is a good thing because I will be able to reread it eventually, but it's also the month that I read my first Brandon Sanderson's book. I read The Final Empire, which was easily a 5-star book. I love this adult fantasy series. It's basically this group of people that are trying to overthrow the empire, and the world building, the magic system, everything is so linked and intriguing and just so good and complex, and I love this, obviously. The first book was so good. I know people were shocked about the ending of book 1, which again, spoiler free, but I was also. I think book 3 is the best in that series, but we'll see if it's the best for that month. I also read Fangirl, which is YA contemporary, which again, I have since realized is not for me, but Rainbow Rowell was everywhere and everyone was talking about her. So obviously I wanted to try her, see if it was for me. That romance was, ugh. I liked the main female character's family. That's what I remember from it, but I hated everything else. So my sister Rosa did not really stick with me. I believe the main character, is it her sister who is like a psychopath or something, but it was just fine. I don't think I've talked about it since. Then I read Flowers for Algernon, which is a modern classic. You have the main character Charlie, who has a low IQ and participates into this experiment to increase his IQ, and oh my gosh, that book. I actually had tears in my eyes once again, so this one is definitely worth checking out. Unwind, I barely remember it. At the time I did enjoy it though. It's like a dystopian YA book, which I feel like the topic will be controversial. It's like late term abortion. I don't remember the ages exactly, but your parents can decide to just give your organs away before you're 18, I think. So I think the author meant for it to be, social commentary, but I'm not sure how well that was received at the time, but I enjoyed it at the time, but don't remember much. Ready Player One was one of those books that, once again, I felt the pressure to like, but I didn't really care for it. It's an adult sci-fi. I feel, again, the movie, everyone knows what it is now, but at the time, meh. Then I read Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. The book was fine. I never got into the movies and never continued. And then the last book I read that month was The Library at Montchar, which I don't get enough of a chance to discuss this book because this is one of the weirdest books I've ever read, but it was worth it. I feel like the first half took me like 7 days, and then I read the second half in 1 day. I just couldn't put it down. I needed to figure out what happened. And it seems to have like multiple stories that eventually converge, and horror, fantasy, maybe a bit sci-fi. It's everything and anything. You have one character, for example, who was kidnapped and is forced by her father, who is kind of a god, to learn every languages ever, but like not normal languages. And like every child in there is forced to learn something. And then there's one part of the story that's an investigation. There's another one. Is it from the point of view of a lion? Like, it is a weird book, but it's something to experiment. And I remember really enjoying it. I feel like I would have to reread this, but it's a hard one to recommend because I do remember including it in a book video about the weirdest books that I've read, but otherwise, I never get the chance to recommend this. So if you're looking for something that is really different, try this. It's something. See, the past couple of months was easy to choose a favorite because there were not that many that worked for me, but in this one, there were so many 5 stars that it is hard. So I think I'm going to give an answer, but it's not going to be my number 1 of the year. Spoiler alert. So I'm going to give it to The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson because I do think it's worth it. It needs a shout out, but it's not going to be my number 1. December, I only read 4 books, which, my gosh, finally, I was reading so many at this point. Makes me feel embarrassed for not finishing more, but to be fair, a lot of them were YA, which I feel like are easier to read. The first one I finished was The Well of Ascension, which is the second book in the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. That one introduced me to one of my all-time favorite character. How do you pronounce his name? I still don't know. Is it Sazed? That's how I pronounced it. I love him to bits. I love really wholesome characters, and that was one of them. You're also introduced to like a second magic system, which was fantastic also. So that one I definitely loved. I gave it 5 star, obviously. I also finished The Raven Boys, which was another fantasy YA series that was super popular. It's a 4-book series. I will eventually make it to book 3. We'll see that in the next video. But I was also left confused as to why it was so popular. I did enjoy the characters, but I really didn't care about the storyline. That's why I never finished the series. I had one more book and I didn't read it. But I enjoyed Blue's Family. And I enjoyed The Raven Boys, but mostly Blue's Family, witches. I have a weakness for them. But yeah, that was just okay. I feel like it was another series that made me realize that maybe I feel like I'm reading all the popular YA books too late because I'm too old for them-ish. I didn't acknowledge that for myself for a couple more years, but looking back, that's how I'm feeling about it. Then I read Angel Fall, which probably similar category. I don't think this was really popular, but it's another YA fantasy series where there are angels, which I think were villains. It's been, again, 8 years, but at the time I thought it was okay, and I just never continued the series. Was it ever finished? For some reason, I believe the 3rd book never was published. Am I wrong? That's all I remember. So there's that. And then the last one I read that month was the 3rd book in the Harry Potter series. So, of course, my number 1 book for December is going to be The Well of Ascension, book 2 in the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. So this was a quick review of all of the books that I finished in 2016. So we have a number 1 for each month, and we need to have a number 1 for the year. That way, when I now talk about 2016, if I want to refer to my best book of the year, I will have one. So I spoiled it a little bit earlier by mentioning it would be a book from November, but not the one I mentioned as my number 1 because I wanted to keep things a little interesting. And I've decided to pick something that I don't think I would have picked at the time. I do think at the time I would have picked the first book in the Mistborn series because it's good. It's really good. And I do think, again, at the time that would have been the one, but I wanted to mention something else because I feel like some books stand the test of time. I feel like looking back, they were so impactful. I still think about them constantly. I still recommend them constantly. So my 2016 number 1 best book will have to be Flowers for Algernon. Don't get me wrong, I loved it and it was emotional at the time, but I still think about this book constantly. It is on my list of books that I want to reread. I'll do that video one day, but this is very high on that list. If I were to ever do a video about like books that will change your life, like very dramatic title, this would be on there. I don't want to say too much more about the storyline because you are following the story of that character as his IQ increases and how his perspective about his life, the people around him changes, of course. And I think it's really interesting also because the book is written in like a journal format, which was kind of hard for me. Again, English is my second language, and at first he's writing with a lot of mistakes because, again, he's not as intelligent as he will become, but seeing the changes and how it affects the writing was also great. But yeah, such an impactful story. I feel like it is a classic for a reason, a modern classic. I know a lot of you had to read this in school, which will never not be shocking to me. Again, it's very emotional, but I feel like this is for adults. Like, you had to read this in, like, middle school, and I feel like if I had to read that at that age, a lot of it would go above my head, so it would be worth rereading if you had to do that as a kid. So it will have to be my number 1 for 2016. That's kinda crazy. But yeah, I love that book. I wanna reread it. I think everyone should read it, and I will be rereading it one day. So this has to be one of the longest videos I've ever had to film. I hope you are excited about this series because, like I said, I will have to do 5 more videos. We're going to do next my 2017 favorites. I think it's just a fun way to discuss books that I haven't had a chance to mention in a while. You get a quick little review, a favorite for each month, and then a number 1 best book of that year. Maybe I should do a bingo card with some favorites. That way you can try to read my all-time best books ever. But yes, 2016, we have a favorite, my number 1 best book of the year. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thumbs up, subscribe. I'll put more of the videos that I've mentioned on the screen. One day when it's up, I'll put the 2017 version so you can continue this journey with me. And I will see you in an upcoming video very soon. Bye. Say hi to the people instead of yelling behind the door. Yeah, pretty girl.